Hey, everybody. Let's go ahead and let's talk about what persuasion is and to just kind of give an overview. I know that you guys are probably kind of familiar with it, and we've talked about it in different ways, but let's just go ahead and just make sure we're all on the same page and everything. So let's talk about persuasive writing. Now, by the way, you might hear the term argumentative writing, you might hear the term persuasive writing, and there is a fine difference between them, but for the purposes of this class and these exercises, we're going to use those words pretty much interchangeably. So, what is it? First off, it's a writing that tries to convince a reader to do something or to believe what you believe about a certain topic. Okay, either you're for it or you're against it. Now, um, if you think about that, there's a couple pieces in there that you really need to think about. And the first one is it tries to convince. In other words, there's a difference between argumentative and informative. Now, there's a lot of informative inside of persuasive, but the goal of persuasive is to convince, is to change somebody's mind or to reinforce the position that they have. So let's make sure that we see that distinction. I think the other piece to really be familiar with or aware of is this idea of what you believe, right? And again, informative writing tends to be a little bit more objective, third person. It doesn't necessarily take a position, whereas persuasive writing does. And so we do start with this is what I believe, right? Even if you don't say that directly, it is evident and it is that is part of the paper that's baked into it. Okay, how do we use persuasion? Well, first off, it's to support a cause, right? Like, please support this team's fundraiser. We're asking people to step up and to do something to give their support or lend a hand to something. It also urges people to action. The call to action is what you often hear it called, where we try to get people to act now, such as vote for Sarah. Do we want people to make a change? We want something to happen, right? We want it to go from this to this, right? The principles should let us wear hats. Or we're trying to prove that something is wrong, or that we're trying to really kind of reinforce that idea that here is something that we see that can be fixed. And here, cell phones don't cause brain cancer, right? Like, people believe that. We want people to change their minds. We also use it to stir up sympathy. If you don't adopt this dog, it will have to live in a shelter. Or even worse, they might have to euthanize you, right? And so, in other words, not only are they trying to get people to act, but they're also trying to get people to like get emotional about it and to stir up what they feel about it. Do we want it to create interest? We want to get people engaged and excited. So we want to move them from to whoa. Better grades will help you get a rewarding job. And again, we're trying to say if you do this, then you will get this. And we're trying to prove that, right? We're trying to get people to buy into that belief. And again, we're trying to get people to agree with us, not just disagree, but to agree. And I'm sure you'll agree that Milky Way is the best candy bar. I'm a Snickers man myself, or a Hershey's, but hey, everybody likes a little something different there. Okay, so how does this paper look? Obviously, it looks a lot like all the rest of the papers we have: introduction, body, and conclusion. Get the hook, introduce a thesis, prove our points, and then wrap things up by again leaving them something to think about. Right? That standard's pretty straightforward. I don't think there's any real big difference there. The one big difference or one thing that you might think about here when we talk about the body, where the argument is explained, what's the best way to get that across? Do we start with like we state a position and then we work our way backwards, like how did we get to it? Do we start with like our biggest main point that really gets people and then we kind of work backwards to some of the weaker ones? Do we show people like, hey, here's everything that isn't right, now let's talk about what is? So there's a lot of different ways that you can approach that, but the general format, introduction, body, conclusion, is pretty much like we've done with everything else. I think one of the biggest things that you really need to understand when it comes to persuasion is knowing your audience. Um, when you think about the audience, certain people respond to certain things, right? Because of who they are, what their experiences are, their age, their sex, their religion, their experience, their education, their social economic status, whatever. There's any number of things that could change that. And so, for instance, I'm much older than you are, and I'm not from Evansville. So I see things a little bit differently. East Siders, West Siders, we all see those things a lot differently, right? And so you really need to understand who your audience is so that you provide the best possible proof for that particular audience, the stuff that will move that audience the most. Typically speaking, now you might envision who the audience could be, right? Who might be engaged by this topic, but realistically, for most of us, we're talking about your peers, your the other students in the class, and your teacher. So something you really need to be aware of when you do argumentative is you have to have a position, right? You have to have a position. You have to have a side. You can't wishy-wash, some of this, some of that, a kind of this and a kind of that. Okay, in the real world, maybe, like, there are people that will only drink Coke, right? There are people that will only drink Coke, and they would rather not drink anything than to drink something other than a Coke. I get that, but that's not necessarily the majority of people, right? A lot of people might have like some more nuanced, or, well, I'm kind of in this and I'm okay with that. I'll just make this do, or whatever. So in the real world, yeah, we might see people not being as emphatic, but when we're doing writing, it's really important to take that side because you're trying to convince people of things. You're trying to get people to buy in, right? And so the more credence you give to any other position, the weaker your position becomes, right? So you want to pick a side. And again, you do want to start off with that position. Make it very clear, very early, where you stand on that issue. That will be the thesis statement. You do have to do your research. No doubt about it. The thing about argumentative is that it has to be research based. If you say, this was a great movie, oh, yeah, why? Because it was great. Well, what made it great? Because it was great. You're not going to prove anything. You're not going to convince anybody of anything. So you definitely have to do your research. You have to have plenty of information to really back up, verify, validify, and support what you're trying to say. The more research you can provide, the better, and the better sources you can provide, the better. Because again, you're asking people to buy into what you say, even if it's the same thing they believe. You're asking people to buy in. You've got to prove your point. Now, when it comes to the actual process of the writing, I've said this many times, you need a plan. You need to you need to do that pre-writing. You need to do that planning piece first. That will make the writing much easier. If you just start in on the writing, it's hard to stay focused. You don't know where you're really going, right? So you definitely want to make a plan. Start off strong. Now, this is a standard look at what an essay could look like. Now, you can adjust this as you go along. Your introduction, your hook, your thesis. Okay, that's getting everybody engaged. The thesis is what I believe very clearly states where you're coming from. Argument 1, argument 2, and argument 3. Now, again, this implies like a very standard 5-6 paragraph essay, right? And then the counter argument. Now, for this assignment, we are going to be doing a counter argument, but sometimes you've got to weigh that. Like, is a counter argument really helpful? Is it going to distract? Does it give people an option? So you do have to be kind of careful with this counter argument. But in any case, you're going to finesse this and kind of adjust this as you need. Just some things to think about as you start to write your persuasive paper. Obviously, start with a thesis that clearly and emphatically states your position. We should never guess where you stand. It should never be confusing. It should always be very clear. You believe this. And the more support you can provide, the better. In your paper, don't use first person. That's casual. That's not formal. That is, it doesn't really show people that you really are taking it seriously, right? So please don't use the first person. With that, you probably ought to avoid the second person as well. So no, I'm, me, we, us, our, and then avoid the you and the yours. Don't be wishy-washy, pick a side. And again, that we talked about that before. You come out of the gates, here's what I believe. And then obviously don't forget to support your opinions because again, the more information you can provide the audience, the better, so that we really get where you're coming from, why you believe that, and why we should believe that. Okay. So again, as we take a look at persuasion and what it is, remember those key points. It is it states your position, it justifies your position, and it asks the audience to consider either changing their position or reinforcing the position that they have.